important conversation.
Absolutely. All right, let's get started, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Gabe Skelton. I'm the director of the sports law program here at Tulane and a law professor here at the law school, and I am also the associate provost for NCAA compliance. So the last few years for me and for my students have been incredibly busy with sports law issues, from the professional ranks down to the collegiate ranks, and we've got a great panel here today to talk about some of the hot topics in the NCAA, and I am going to turn it over very shortly to Andrew Sensi, who is a student here at the law school at 3L, who is going to be moderating the panel, and he will introduce the panelists. But I just want to say a couple quick words about the sports law program, just to thank the students who put this together, because what we try to do here at the sports law program is get students as involved as possible. And many of the things we do here at Tulane couldn't be done without the students, and this one in particular, because they did literally everything from start to finish. From coming up with the topics, from getting the speakers down, from getting the speakers literally into the room. So I want to thank the students who have done it, and so thank you to Andrew Sensei, to Nick Sabella, who's the president of the Sports Law Society, and then to Emma Stenberg and Aaron Banks, who are Aaron Banks. For all of your hard work, this is a tough task to pull off any time of year, but particularly during the Final Four, when I know all of you have incredibly busy schedules. So I want to thank all of you personally for taking the time out to come all the way uptown when I know all the action is downtown. But it's nice to be able to breathe some fresher air up here and see some grass. So we appreciate you guys being here. I appreciate all of you being here on a beautiful Friday afternoon. So with that, let me turn it over to Andrew to take it from there. All right.
Well, I want to first of all thank all of our panelists for coming, and then thank you all for coming here on a Friday afternoon. I know that you don't have class, so appreciate you stopping by the law school. I'm just going to take a quick second, introduce the panelists, and then we're going to get right into it. Got a couple of questions. Hopefully it's going to be pretty free-flowing, but at a certain point we'll open up the floor for questions, so it should be pretty good. Starting from my left here, I have John Long from Southeastern Louisiana University. He's been there for the last year and a half as the assistant to the president for athletic compliance. To his left, we have Mike Alden, the director of athletics for Missouri. Mr. Alden began working at Missouri in 1998, and since then he's seen several programs rise to the level of national championship contenders, highlighted by conference championships in football, men's basketball, soccer, and softball the past 2 seasons. And gymnastics' first ever NCAA title in 2010. And he's also been obviously very busy with the move to the SEC, so hopefully he has some good things to say about that. Mr. Alden is also the current president of the Division IA Athletic Directors Association. To his left, we have Tulane alum Renee Gamilla. She graduated in 2000 with a sports law certificate and was on the Sports Lawyers Journal. After graduation, she worked at the University of Colorado Compliance Office, and in 2002 was hired by the NCAA, where she's been ever since, and she's currently the Associate Director of Enforcement. And to her left, we have Mr. Timothy Epstein. He's a partner at Smith Amundsen. He's a chair of the firm's Sports Law Practice Group, and his work includes sports product issues, amateur representation issues, and NCAA and high school association violations. He's been published numerous times, and he's also an adjunct professor at Loyola in Chicago. And last but not least, we have down on the left there Mr. Greg Byrne. He's the director of athletics at the University of Arizona. He was actually just named to that position in May of 2010, so he's only been there a short while. But prior to that, he was Mississippi State's University Director of Athletics. So he's had a long career in sports administration. So with that, we're going to get right into the questions. I don't know how many of you had a chance to see. I know we were talking earlier about social media and the NCAA being everywhere. There was actually an article on it in the New York Times this morning. And just this week, the Michigan State athletic director, he tweeted to Michigan point guard Trey Burke, who's considering entering the NBA draft, his advice on the matter. He says, "My advice, believe in your heart and mind. everything else is interference. People you seek out is better than those that seek you. So with that in mind, we also had the University of North Carolina's whole investigation sparked by a tweet. So, Mr. Alden and Mr. Byrne, I was wondering if you could speak to the policies that you have and kind of how you see things going forward with Twitter and Facebook and all that with your athletes.
Well, we just had an all-student athlete meeting. What's today? Friday, Tuesday this week, and had all four as a mandatory deal with all 450 of our student athletes for our 19 sports. And we had these policies already before, but we had a little springtime reminder for everyone. And we ask and require all of our student athletes to register their Facebook and Twitter accounts with our compliance office and to friend people in our compliance office. We have a young man named Preston Wages, who's a law school grad from Arkansas, who is in charge of social media, monitoring that for our compliance office and for our department. And we spend a lot of time on education on what the expectation levels are for them representing us as soon as they sign a scholarship with us. And at times, 98% of them are really good, and that 2% is the one you spend your most time working with. We haven't had really any objections from the student athletes regarding the fact that they have to register them, and I can't tell you, I know Preston tries to stay on top of who does and who doesn't have them as much as he possibly can. At the same time, we're dependent on them being open and honest with us, the fact that they have the accounts. And what we did just the other day was we covered up their names, but we showed up on our video board in the McHale Center, which is our basketball arena, we showed some tweets that we didn't think were quite appropriate, and a couple Facebook postings, and that got their attention. And so we said, and threatened, they didn't promise them, but said we may decide to unveil some of those, who they are in the future, if you'd like to do that as well. And that's just, as much as it is a reflection on our department, on their coaches, on their teams, it's also a reflection on them as individuals. It's a reflection on them and their family. And part of our responsibility in working with the student athletes while they're there is for them to understand that their actions there could potentially have long-term ramifications, good or bad. And so we need to make sure that they understand when they choose to be involved in that they're being viewed by a lot of different people, and different people can do different things with it. So that's ours in a nutshell.
So, I think part of that is I think all of us would be hopeful we're ahead of it. We can get ahead of it. There's no way. I mean, we're just playing. I mean, we're playing. We're the catcher, right? So, because these things are coming at us all the time, and so how do you address it? Because the minute you try to address one issue, another thing may pop up relative to social media and stuff. But what we've tried to do, and I think a lot of people in the Big 12 looked at it this way, has been how do we monitor at least the Facebook? Because we know we can be able to get those things registered, we can make sure that those are friended, so we do that with our kids. And from a Twitter standpoint and from a tweet standpoint, we really just use an educational effort on our part to the best of our ability. And where Greg may do this in a full departmental meeting, we just break ours out into squad meetings. And so what will happen is every one of our teams that we'll spend time with them, myself, some members of our Student Athlete Advisory Council, so there's some of their peers versus dad coming in and telling you, you shouldn't do this, or this is something that's good, or that. Then they need to have their brothers and sisters, so to speak, in there with them. So it's a huge issue. It's something that I wish, from a control freak standpoint, that we could say we got our hands around it, we know what we're doing, we're on top of it, but there's no way. I mean, all we're doing is just reacting all the time. And so what we've tried to do is do that by at least understanding from a Facebook standpoint, so we can have communication there, always monitoring that, having that friended, and then using these educational opportunities with not only some of our leadership team and our coaches, but also their peers to be able to help us continue to educate them. We do that about twice a year. So.
For Renee and John, do you all see any issues as far as compliance or enforcement coming at it? Can you talk about your thoughts on that?
Well, as you mentioned initially, the North Carolina case you all heard about started from some tweets and some Facebook posts. And, the point is it's out there. From an NCAA perspective, we don't regulate what schools have to do, how they monitor it. What we say, and this is just all part of an institution control situation, is you have to put a policy and procedure in place. You as an institution decide what you think is going to work best for you, for your student athletes, for your area. The point is, if you have that policy in place, you have to follow it. That's where you can get into issues from our perspective. The institutions are not going to want to hear this, I imagine. We, in enforcement, have actually started monitoring that on a more consistent basis. It's the same thing. We can't get ahead of it either, but we know that there's information out there that can lead to actionable cases and situations. And the point is, we want to try to get it before the press gets it and try to get control of it, and if we can, help the institutions. The past year and a half, we've done some major restructuring in our enforcement department, and as part of that restructuring, we actually have a group now called the Information Management Group. It's IMG, and part of their responsibility is to sit and look online, look for trends. For instance, we also have a football issues group, of which I'm a part. So our IMG liaison during the National Signing Day in early February was on, watching Twitter, watching Facebook, kind of seeing what trends were going out there through tweets, or what was, social media, what was Missouri doing, what was Arizona doing. What was a kid in South Florida who said they're going to Florida that all of a sudden signs with Florida State, what happened there? So we're also trying to use it for our enforcement purposes as well.
From an institutional standpoint, we do not want to get in the business of having to track 18-year-old kids and what they do online. I mean, I can say that flat out, especially when you look at the lower Division I institutions that have limited staff compared to some of the big guys who are held accountable to the same rules. That being said, one of the issues that you mentioned, I think you spoke about the Trey Burke situation and Roy Roundtree, is situations where you have players who are tweeting to prospects for recruitment purposes, congratulatory statements, whatever. Depending on which institution you talk to, that may or may not be a violation. We've reached out and we've spoken to a Big 12 institution who is adamant that if that situation happens, that it's not a violation. Looking at the legislation itself, it doesn't quite, it's a little behind, I guess you could say, the social media trends that we're experiencing, because you look at the bylaw itself, where some recruiting bylaws will distinguish between actions on the part of student athletes versus actions on the part of institutional staff members. If you look at public comments about signings, it just specifies member institutions. Well, if you go to your interpretation on the issue to try to get some more guidance, basically the interpretation, which I have here, says a student athlete may not provide comments to the media regarding a prospect other than confirming the institution's recruitment of the prospect. That begs the question of what media is. In the Twitter levels of privacy, if I have a private Twitter account where only my friends and family members are following me and I tweet about another prospect, am I speaking out to the media at that point? Now, if I'm a prospect and I'm being followed by Sports Illustrated, and I know that there's the likelihood of them seeing what I'm tweeting is going to be reported to the media per se, is that reaching out to the media? So I think the NCAA rules and bylaws are a little bit behind as far as addressing how institutions, and specifically student athletes, should proceed with tweeting other prospects.
It's interesting as John's talking about that. So you guys, I mean, how we apply that and trying to get our hands around it. So we signed the #1 prospect in the country in football. Kid was featured on the front page of Parade magazine, all that other kind of stuff.
And we have to play this.
And when this kid signs with Mizzou, these are examples. We have a kid that plays for the Philadelphia Eagles named Jeremy Macklin. We got a kid that plays for the Atlanta Falcons named Sean Witherspoon, and we got a kid actually that plays for the Saints, and his name is Chase Daniel. Those are just 3 examples. So what happens is those guys are pumped, right? So they shoot out a tweet about, congratulations, his name's Doriel Greenback. Congratulations, DGB, all that other kind of stuff and everything. So violate. Now we turned ourselves in on that as a violation. So as I'm listening, maybe we didn't need to turn. That's on who you saw. I'm sitting between.
We self-reported our coach tweeting a prospect, so the IMG people didn't have to come after us. We beat them to it. But prospects, we haven't had that situation happen. I don't know.
Did we do the right thing turning ourselves in on that?
In my experience, yes. One thing we would say from an enforcement perspective is institutions, should err on the side of caution. We have a separate department. It's our AMA group. that issues our interpretations and is responsible for the drafting of that legislation. We would recommend institutions go through that process, and get your yes or no answer. But if you're not sure, if you haven't done that, it's better to go ahead and submit it to us. We can take a look at it. Generally, we'll try to catch that if it's not an issue and, let the institution know. If you don't, if an institution doesn't and there turns out to be a bigger issue as a result of it, then you're answering the question, well, why didn't you, self-report it, which is part of your NCAA responsibility as a member. Getting to, I guess, the issue of the general legislation question, I think that's been the beef with NCAA legislation from day one, and it'll probably always continue to be that. It's impossible to, enumerate every single rule down to the nitty-gritty detail. It's also impossible to go so broad-based with the rules, which frankly is what we're trying to do now. We're trying to go more to a principle-based rule system and get rid of, 13.1.3.A, B, 1, whatever, and just get to 13.1.3. You cannot do this, period. You all understand it, having the legal background. You just do that broad-based rule. Well, 5 years from now, we've had 10 issues as a result of that broad-based rule, so now we've added legislation into that 13.1.3, and we're back to the 13.1.3A, 1.2, whatever you want to say about it. So it's kind of a very cyclical thing. If anybody wanted to do the history of NCAA legislation from the moment it was in print through till now, I think you could probably look at every, 10, 15 years, and we kind of go through this cleaning house. We're currently doing that now, hopefully to address, again, some of these issues of where is that gray area and just make it pretty broad-based, black and white, but it's not going to cover everything. And then the problem, from our perspective, enforcement is the moment, a school sees that, not every school, but there are schools or there are coaches, there are situations, they're going to try to find that gray area and they're going to push for that. Other schools that aren't doing that are going to cry foul, but it's not contrary to our legislation as we have it, and then we kind of have to clean up that mess as well. So it's a constant flow.
In defense of the NCAA, which I don't think you will hear me say 3 times in my life, there are different considerations for state actors, state schools versus private schools. So for the NCAA to actually come up with a bylaw that would address both the constitutional considerations of a private school versus state school, I think you might run into some problems. So certain things that you guys are going to have to consider at state institutions are different than what Tulane has to consider. Loyola University in Chicago, where I'm a law professor, adjunct, they have a complete ban on social media. Student athletes are not allowed to have a Facebook account or a Twitter account. Now they can do that under the law because they're a private institution. But that can be used against them for recruiting purposes, because what is the social interaction that these kids have? They might interact more with their peers on social media than they do in person. So if I'm a coach, I'm going to use that as a recruiting tool against the coach at Loyola or another school that bans it. You also have, and I don't know if it's changed since everything that went down at Penn State, but Penn State did not have a social media policy, period. So it goes from complete ban to you guys somewhere in the middle to not having a policy at all. And I think what we thought we were going to see with UNC, where the notice of allegations that came down was a lack of monitoring of social media as a potential violation. Now there's no legislation on that, so that freaked everybody out. Oh my God, how can you make up a crime that wasn't actually written as a crime at that point? Thankfully, when the report of allegations came down 10 days ago maybe about that, it said, this is not included, we are not going to have this be a point of punishment, but we are putting you on notice that as time is going further, this is something that we're going to expect. And people that work with Renee have told me it is not sufficient to just hire a third-party service to do your monitoring for you. There's going to need to be some framework in place. And I know there's a cost there that you don't want to hear about, but it's not so much the social media itself and monitoring of it, but if you're put on notice that something's going on, alcohol, drugs, recruiting violation, and you have a reasonable suspicion that something will be going on with this particular student athlete, you have a duty to monitor that specific student athlete's social media going forward. So your current policies are actually not required by the NCAA. It's being proactive, but I think the standard would be for someone like Penn State, if they didn't have a policy going forward, if they're put on notice, they have a duty to actually monitor that social media.
Great responses. That's more than I could have hoped for there.
Can I say one more thing to it real quick? And this is actually talking to the students. At every class I ever speak to, I ask them, how many of you are on Facebook? So how many of you are on Facebook? Okay. Anybody not on Facebook? Good for you. I'm on it. I'm actually thinking about getting rid of my page. I don't like Facebook that much because they get too much into your private life, in my opinion. And but how many of you are not on Twitter? Okay. We're trying to, I don't know what the solution is right now, but there's opportunities to monetize that at some point. Okay. I released, and Andy knows this, I released two, because he came and wrote an article about it, but I released two I was hiring as our new football coach on Twitter. That picture alone got 67,000 views. Okay? Most of those things I put out don't get that many views, but I hired Rodriguez. And so when we hire young people, part of what I hope we find is people that have ideas and are able to be on the forefront of thinking how to handle social media. And so if you aren't on Twitter and Facebook, you should be. Because one of the things you have to think about is, how do I separate myself from people? It's such a competitive job market. I told you about Preston Wages. He's a young guy, has a law degree. We're paying him, I don't know, $40,000 a year to be an entry-level compliance person. And we had 140 applicants for that job. So part of what you have to do is you have to learn how to separate yourself from the competition, and for you to be creative along those thought processes as you're going into the job market after law school. That helps you. And so just as a talking to the students, I would say that in every class I speak to.
Definitely good advice.
Yeah.
I got him in probably about a year ago. I'm addicted now.
Yeah.
It's not always the best thing.
Pat Forty told me, and he's an old newspaper columnist, and I don't know if Andy would say the same, but Pat Forty, from Yahoo now, told me, he said he reads Twitter before he reads the paper, and he's a newspaper guy. So it's really amazing thing.
That's how I get all my news.
Yeah.
Because when I was in journalism school, when the internet was only dial-up, and I would go to the paper and click through the AP wire and thought it was the coolest thing in the world. Now I can personalize my AP wire with exactly what I want. So that's.
And if you want to know anything about barbecue, follow Andy on Twitter.
That's all I do is tweet pictures of food.
That's right.
So, I got to ask you then, where have you been so far for barbecue down here?
I haven't been to any barbecue places yet. I'm going to try to get to the joint in the Lower Ninth Ward before I get out of town. So.
The joint would be number one.
Yeah, I'm going to get
Okay, so switching gears, totally different subject. Multi-year scholarships. So for 40 years, institutions could only have the 1-year option, basically. And now, after a bit of a struggle, it's passed, and now schools can start offering it. So I'm just curious for your all's thoughts on the good and the bad of that, and how does it affect transfer students. So if you have a 4-year scholarship now, but you want to transfer, how are schools going to deal with that? So pretty much open, whoever wants to start on that one.
Well, it's totally recalled, right? As to going forward.
Not this, the multi-year is, the override was not successful, so it is in place.
2 votes.
Oh, by 2 votes?
Yeah, it was a very close override, so we frankly at the NCAA, aren't moving forward with a lot of confidence in it, obviously. It was definitely that, and then the other issue with the $2,000 stipend, the institution, I think, sending us and sending our leadership a message of where we're going and what direction we're going in. But it is currently going forward. I'll let institutions talk about how they're going to handle it again. Generally with the NCAA, we try to put in some broad legislation. This is how it has to go about, but then it's up to institutions to kind of decide what works best for them within that legislation. The transfer rules are still in place, so regardless of where a student athlete is with their multi-year scholarship, they're still going to have to meet those transfer rules, and those are not going away. And in fact, the additional academic standards for transferring, for 2-4 transfers for our initial eligibility kids, that we're actually increasing all of that. We're really trying to put a base in academics even more so, and really send the message. It's student athlete and it's student first for a reason. But that's really all we're at right now. I don't know where we're going to be in 3 and 4 years, but I'll let the institutions speak to how they're going to handle it.
Go ahead.
the multi-year contracts, the multi-year scholarships for student athletes really, at least from one institution's perspective, won't impact us at all, not at all. So the difference between a single-year scholarship renewable and a multi-year scholarship, we look at it this way, is if you're dissatisfied with a student athlete for whatever reasons that may be, you can tell them when it was a one-year deal, we're not going to renew your scholarship at the end of the year. Now, if that student athlete wanted to be able to appeal that, there's an appellate group on campuses. So there is one here at Tulane, and there's one at Loyola, and there's one at Arizona and Southeast. We all have those. So that a student athlete, if they feel like, hey, this isn't right, I want to appeal this to some people, and it's not people that are part of the athletic program, it's people that are appointed from campus, they review that. And they have an opportunity then to overturn that situation if you were trying to remove that scholarship. You're going to have the same opportunities to do that. It's just you're going to have a multi-year commitment to a student athlete that you're going to be dealing with there. So the reasons why you might remove a student athlete, many people think it's because they're not very good. That's what they always think. Well, they're no good. They're trying to run them off. That is that's an infinitesimal group of students. It really is. Those are the ones that flash up. That is it could be they're not going to class. It could be they're being knuckleheads on a Friday night. It could be that they're being insubordinate to the coaching staff. It could be that, there could be a million reasons why you're trying to say, hey, I don't think this is working for you at Mizzou. And so if it's not working for you at Mizzou, then we're not going to renew your scholarship. And we'll have the ability to do that with a student athlete, whether they're in their first year, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year. And as long as you can have reasons why you would not want to continue that scholarship, you absolutely have the ability to do it. So for us, having a multi-year scholarship, I guess it's great, but it really isn't going to change the way that we do business.
When I saw the legislation on this, I thought, oh, sounds good to me. No problem. And then I'm going to talk two parts here. One is we actually, and I always get confused on overrides. We voted against the override. We voted for the override, and I thought we were going to vote against it. Okay, you know why we voted for the override, which means we were against the rule. We took it to our SAC. Which is our Student Athlete Advisory Committee. I purposely did not go to the meeting because I go to all of them because I wanted them to not say, well, Mr. Byrne, what do you think? Because I wanted them to come to their own independent conclusion on this. They were presented the facts, they were given the information, and they had a meeting by themselves. They have an unofficial meeting, I think they call it, the day before we always meet, and then they came the next day to that meeting. That's the regular meeting. So they took a vote of our SAC, which that day there were 17 of our SAC members there. They voted 15-2 against the multi-year scholarship. Our student athletes did. And so I was like, Rocky LaRose, who's our deputy AD, she came back from the meeting and said, you're never going to believe this. And so from there and through that discussion, we voted against it. They felt at Arizona that they knew their scholarship pretty much was guaranteed for 4 or 5 years for them to graduate, and that the only time there wasn't somebody that was given that was if, one, that student athlete decided to transfer on their own, or two, somebody on their team, so to speak, was such a knucklehead that the rest of the team didn't want them on there anymore. And they didn't want to do anything that would make it more challenging, because we have the same appeal process that Mike talked about, make it more challenging for the coach to be able to act on that. And so one of the things with that, what Dr. Emmert's doing in his leadership position as president of the NCAA, I think a lot of things we're looking at are very good. And Dr. Brand before him, his emphasis was focused on the academic mission, trying to get our arms around that. And those were very good steps. And each president will have their own different things that they're going to try to do as NCAA. One of the things that has really concerned me, and Mike's actually been involved in some of it from the AD level, but it's almost all coming from the presidential level. And the presidents are our bosses. We need to be held accountable to the presidents. There's no doubt about that. However, the presidents also have a university to run. And so I'm concerned about, and Mike can speak on it better than I can because he's more involved in that than I am right now, but I'm concerned about some of these things are being done and kind of just forced through without maybe getting the input all the way down to the student athlete level. And you don't want to, create issues to where it slows down the process and nothing gets done. But is there a balance there somewhere to where that's taking place? And so, and again, I want to make sure you understand, I think a lot of what we're trying to do is really good. But I also think that that's created some challenges. And I don't know, Mike, if you want to expand on that.
No, I mean, there's stuff I think that'll come up possibly, that Greg's doing a lead-in that maybe Tim or John, myself, Greg, Renee, all of us can respond to. But there's some efforts that are going on, but you come back to this meeting that took place in August of 2011. It was a presidential summit. I was actually there. So there were a couple of ADs that were there. And, but in it is great that you got the CEOs in the room. Now, most people that are dealing with CEOs, and I'm not talking about campuses, I mean anywhere, CEOs, a lot of times they're the last people that really kind of know what's exactly going on. They need to have their advisors around them. They need to know what's happening. So they're trying to make a decision and not in an informed environment. So at that time, when they had the presidential summit, it was great. There were a lot of presidents that were there. But decisions were being made and directives being given and timelines being put in place that I don't really believe that most of the people that were voting on that stuff kind of knew what was happening there. And so when they talk about multi-year scholarship, this is an example. Our SAC, our student athletes, were exactly like Greg's. And I would tell you, and John, I don't know about yours at Southeast, but I think if you polled all student athletes, I would tell you, I think the vast majority would say, we don't need multi-year scholarship. So that's just an example. It's going to go through, it's going to happen, and then we're going to deal with it the way we talked about it. But again, a lot of those decisions that were being made, we're dealing with some of those decisions now based upon trying to react to some things.
Sure. I think the students probably feel the way that they do because most of their teammates who are not renewed or for whatever reason most of the time are knuckleheads or do something along that line. Of course, then after they leave Missouri, we offer them a scholarship, and then it turns out we get the same thing happen to us at the FCS level. But you asked about the good and the bad, and to tell you the truth, the reason why I think that this proposal did not get defeated, and it's almost kind of like a political pork type thing or an attachment, but one of the provisions of the proposal was the ability to give student athletes who have exhausted their eligibility or passed the 5th and 6th year to be able to provide them with an athletic scholarship. And I think that that portion of the proposal was widely supported, whereas there was a lot more hesitance towards the multi-year portion of that proposal. And I think that probably made the difference, to tell you the truth. I think there are some good things for it from speaking from a mid-major level. Maybe we can get a prospect that goes to the Conference USA or wants to go to a higher conference to come to our institution if we offer another year or two at them. The reality of the situation is, I think there will not be that big of an effect, as Mike alluded to. One of the reasons being that you can write the contracts for these multi-year scholarships. You can provide yourself with enough out clauses to basically cover any situation which would be the reason why you would get rid of those kids in the first place. Southeastern Louisiana is the exact same way, and as you just don't see student athletes who get non-renewed for performance reasons. It just doesn't happen. It's always some kind of insubordination or something like that. Well, if you put and word these carefully, and this is why law firms who work in the field, this is an area, maybe an area of potential expansion into their practice. If you detail and contract properly multi-year scholarships, you can give yourself enough outs as an institution to where this will have minimum to no effect on you going forward. It puts that burden on the institutions to make sure that those agreements are drafted properly. And when Mike said, he said contracts at first, I think he's actually absolutely correct by phrasing it and terming it that way, because that's what it's going to come down to, is how you word those contracts, what clauses you put in those contracts to be able to disassociate yourself with those student athletes.
You bring up lawsuits, and I think it's important to see what this is in reaction to and what some of the other new legislation is in reaction to. A lot of it is in reaction to lawsuits that are currently getting filed against the NCAA. And if you can put some of the causation to rest that's that's at the head of some of those lawsuits, I think maybe the thought is we'll be proactive and we won't get hammered as much, or we can just do something from the standpoint of, you know, risk mitigation. And I think you see that with the multi-year scholarships. I think you see that with the scholarship enhancement. Because right now, frankly, the NCAA is getting assaulted from a lot of sides in courtrooms. And there is a realistic possibility, if Keller and O'Banion are successful, that a huge revenue stream that would be going to the NCAA is going to be gone. So I think there's a little bit of you know, trying to throw something out there to get some mercy there from a legal standpoint.
Sure. Well, I guess I can't skip over the fact, since, you know, we have switching conferences, and that's been, you know, for the past 2 years, I guess, just been a huge thing with teams moving all over the place, and then you get teams saying they're going to the Big East. Oh no, we're not. We're going to go here, and, you know, switching back and forth. So if you could talk a little bit about that, as far as, you know, what's the impetus behind some of these moves, and kind of how do you keep the student first and the student athlete as far as extended travel and things like that?
Well, and again, the panelists are going to have, I'm sure, comments on this as well too. But as a school that's gone through this, so Mizzou will enter the Southeastern Conference July 1st of 2012. So we'll be members of the SEC, the 14th member of the SEC. Two new teams, two schools enter, Texas A&M and Mizzou, to make it a 14-institution league. And I think there's a variety of reasons why people have moved, and certainly Nebraska had reasons why they felt it was better, in their better interest, to be in the Big Ten, or Colorado to go to the Pac-12. Or I'm talking to Lynn Hickey today. Lynn Hickey is the athletics director at the University of Texas San Antonio, because they're going to be meeting with Conference USA and the Mountain West, because as they take a look at this mega merger, you know, how's that going to affect this and that. And it's for a variety of reasons. You know, I think some people initially will look at conference realignment as being completely revenue-driven. And that there's certainly some validity to why Nebraska may say, I want to leave the Big 12 to go to the Big 10. I think the Big 10 network and the footprint and the exposure and a lot of the other things clearly are an opportunity for Nebraska to grow their revenue. There's no question. But at the same time, I think they were looking for some different things, like, let's say Mizzou was, because we came from the same league. I think we were looking for stability as far as a league that was going to be together. And certainly you followed this in our league for the last year. When you wake up and you look across, you get your Twitter feed, right? So I'm checking in the morning, now looking at the paper, I'm looking at that and finding out that Oklahoma and Oklahoma State and Texas and Texas A&M, Texas Tech, they're going to go listen to Larry Scott and the Pac-12. And so, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And so with all that kind of movement, you're looking for stability. I think the other thing that I think people look for in conference alignment, or at least we did, is we wanted also equality. I think you want people to be treated the same. The Big 12, so I'm only speaking from our league standpoint. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. So as you guys look at the Big 12, if you know much about that, and I've talked about this before, is that the formation of the Big 12 initially was flawed from the start. There was a flaw from the start, because you grew your family from 8 people to 12. You adopted 4 kids, okay? And so normally, when you have a family of 12, or 8, or 12, whatever the number is, and they all sit around the dinner table, everybody kind of gets the same amount of food, usually. I mean, they get an opportunity for it. But that wasn't the way that the Big 12 was established. You know, there was a revenue disparity with how you shared different types of things. And so I think that for us, we were looking for, you know, leagues like the Big 10. You know, everything is kind of all in the SEC, and that's where Greg came from. He knows this. Okay, it's all in. Everybody's trying to work together. So there are a variety of reasons why you might want to do that. You also take a look at the footprint geographically. So a school like Mizzou, you're taking a look at the growth factor in the country. Okay, we're trying to attract more students to come to Mizzou. Our main recruiting areas outside of the state of Missouri are going to be Dallas Metroplex and Chicago. Those are the 2 main areas that kids, not athletes, these are students, they come to our school, right? So we're looking at the demographic shifts in the country, man. We need to be going to Atlanta. We need to be going to Nashville. We need to be going to Orlando because the population shift of what's going there, it provides more exposure. So there's a variety of reasons. Why is San Diego State going to be part of the Big East? I have no idea. Okay, but for whatever reasons, they have reasons why they would do that. I would tell you that today, in 2012, my opinion, and again, these guys can join in on this, this ain't over. I mean, there's no way. There's no way this is over. You know, it is from Mizzou, and we're glad for that. And I can't speak for the Pac-12, right? It's in that right now in other leagues, but in my personal opinion, I don't think it's over. And there's a variety of reasons why people are looking to make those moves.
And I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
You didn't put me on the
To
spot.
speak for everybody. You know, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask.
Well, I've only answered that question a couple of times in the last year. So.
Does anybody else have any other thoughts on conference realignment?
Yeah, I think with the Pac-12, because from a geographic standpoint, we're obviously not going to go west because there's a lot of water that way, and a lot of schools shepherd wide. And going east for us is a pretty big jump. And so when Mike was right, you know, when we were looking at maybe becoming the Pac-16, and it was close to happening. The schools we were talking to at that point made the most sense from a geographical standpoint for us. And understandably so from the Pac-12 standpoint, academically views itself in a high manner with a lot of the schools that are in our league. And so it's got to be that right fit both from an academic and an athletic standpoint. And so I do think there could be another round. What it would be, you know, your guess is probably as good as mine on where that would shake down. Obviously, television's been a big part of the movement, the shift, and also college football has been a big part of that too. And so I think it's important for the schools to understand that's a critical component. All the issues that we have from a economic model in college athletics right now, the one thing you keep going back to is that you need to be strong in football in order, if you're going to be in one of those big conferences. That's important in what takes place. That's why you continue to see the investment in infrastructure that's taking place across the country. And so when it'll stop, I don't know. There's a part of me that really doesn't like it because you hate to, and Mike can speak on this better than I can, you hate to see some of those natural connections dissolve, but at the same time too, you have to look after your institution's best interests. And so trying to find that balance of what takes place, because when the Pac-16 almost happened, there were some schools. My friend is the AD at Kansas State, John Curry, and I think he was very concerned about where Kansas State was going to end up during that time if the Big 12 would have fallen apart. And that's a great institution. It had a lot of history and a lot of good things, and so I hope it slows down. But I'm guessing Mike's right that at some point there'll probably be some other movement.
I think you're going to see other movement too, because the Big East is inherently flawed. You have basketball schools and football schools, and I think there was a move way back when for Penn State wanting to join the Big East, and Tranghese, is that how you pronounce his name? I was missing Tranghese. He's a basketball guy, and he said no to Penn State joining as a football member. And then you had apparent mistreatment of the football schools that were there. So you have Miami and Virginia Tech and BC saying, and Syracuse at that time too, saying we want to leave. We have no desire to have some of these things that are going on, including some revenue sharing aspects. Why should we have to, we're bringing all this money for football, why should we share it with Seton Hall and Providence? It's tough to be able to justify it. You talk to these Kentucky fans who are here in New Orleans, I'm sure they're going to be the predominant fans that are down here. If you asked any one of them what makes more money, Kentucky basketball or football, they would all tell you basketball, but what's the answer? Football. So the Big East is flawed, and I think the Big East is probably one of the biggest problems why there's going to keep being movement until you separate out football. I don't think that conference is going to work in the current scheme.
Mike made a great point too about everybody getting the same plate of food at the table. And one of the greatest things Larry Scott has done as commissioner of our league since he's taken over that role is we found a way, and I was sitting in those meetings, we found a way to get to equal revenue sharing. And that was tremendous. What's the strongest professional sports league? NFL. What do? They revenue share report. SEC and the Big Ten have been viewed as the strongest and most stable leagues out there from a college sports standpoint. What do? They share the revenue report when it comes to conference revenue. And so now, as an institution or as a conference, we're arm in arm with USC and UCLA and Stanford, Cal, and Washington, which are, and then the folks up in Tempe north of us. We're all together. And so those are some big television markets, and that was part of what made our conference so valuable. Is you got some major media markets in that footprint, and Larry and Kevin Weiberg and our Pac-12 team went out and did a really good job of uniting together and showing that we were strong, and that us being showing that we had equal revenue sharing made us a much more attractive television partner, and that helped us, and it's helping everybody else out too.
That's huge what Greg is talking about. And again, I don't know how this resonates with you guys, but he used a name, and there dropped a name in his comments there, and the name was Kevin Weiberg. You may have picked it up or not picked it up. Kevin Weiberg was the commissioner of the Big 12 Conference, and a heck of a commissioner. He'd come from the Big 12. He understood everything that needed to take place for the league to get strong, and he left because he couldn't get that done. And then what happens, lo and behold, he ends up over in the Pac-12 working with Larry Scott, doing something that no one thought was going to happen. And that was UCLA, USC coming to the table and others and saying, we're going to share it all equally, because it had never been done. And now what you've seen with that, television contracts are going through the roof for the Pac-12, more exposure, programs are going to get stronger, facilities are going to be developed greater than they've ever been before. And the league is setting itself up for huge success. I believe that, down the line. But it comes back to what Greg talked about. But there was a key person in that part of that, I think. And his name was Kevin Weiberg.
Yeah, it's given us great guidance through this. It's been awesome. And a good guy too.
All right, well, one last question for me. Hopefully it's a little bit of more of a fun one before we open up to questions. So let's say tomorrow that you wake up and whoever has the power to bestow this upon you, you are now the NCAA czar, with all-knowing, all-powerful. No one can overturn you. What? I'm definitely looking forward to Mr. Epstein's on this one.
All right, well, then I'll stay last.
But what would be your first order of business? What would be the first thing you wanted to do?
Yeah, since I work for the current I'll plead the fifth on this. No, I think mine is short, but just this is an internal perspective, so it's going to be completely different. And the first one is very self-serving, admittedly. I would pay our staff more. The majority of our staff, we really do the bulk of the work, and we do represent. And this isn't just big Division I football or big Division I basketball. We have Division II, we have Division III. We do handle the bulk of the work, whether it's championships, whether it's enforcement, whether it's just the rules and regulations on and off the field, the governance process, whatever it is, for 1,200 institutions. So we really do quite a bit. Our staff is somewhere around 450, and the bulk of them, everybody talks about all this big bad money, but it's not, we're not seeing it. And not that we're all going to be, millionaires working at the NCAA, but that, I would do that, definitely. And the other thing externally, less self-serving, is we're starting to see more of this. I think this is one thing President Emmer has done a good job, and he definitely is more savvy to the power of the media and the need to probably be less controversial or contentious with them at times. I think we need to do an even better job of educating not only our institutions, and frankly, yes, our institutions, but the public in general, the press, about our processes, our procedures. There are things that we get dinged about that it's just a lack of understanding and knowledge. And I think that would help us and help our dealings with the institutions. So those are mine.
I think mine would be it's pretty short for me. I would set up a separate division in the NCAA. What I mean by that is I would have one other division which would have more like institutions. And the reality of this is Michigan State and Missouri and Arizona have a lot more in common and have issues that are different than Quinnipiac. Okay, and that doesn't mean that Quinnipiac isn't a fine institution, and so is Tulane and a lot of schools. Okay, but when you're sitting at a table and you're trying to make decisions that we know are going to be impacting things in East Lansing or in Tucson, or in Columbia or whatever that may be, it becomes very challenging to be able to try to get things accomplished that certainly are going to have a direct impact on us. And so that's what I would do. I would take a different, so it's whatever the division is, or just separate that one out and say, this is a different group right here.
I would abolish the APR. The APR, for those of you who are not exactly familiar with the scoring system and rating of it, you get a retention point and an eligibility point each semester for all scholarship athletes. Unfortunately, with the recruiting model the way it is and the limitations on the coaching staff and the institutional staff to get to know prospects, I believe that a lot of the times you aren't able to do enough research into what is really beyond a lot of the student athletes. I think that's especially compounded with international student athletes. You can ask an international student athlete 100 times how much do they value an American degree, but as soon as they think that they have a shot at potentially playing pro in a foreign country or maybe their home country, a lot of the times you're going to see that student athlete say, you know what, this is more important to me. I came to this NCAA institution to showcase my skills in the first place. They can give you all the right answers. They can say everything, but without having the ability, and for international prospects, it costs a lot of money to bring those kids over on official visits or to go and recruit them. For an institution that's positioned like a Quinnipiac or a Southeastern Louisiana, it gets tough to really go in and investigate what your recruits, what is in their mind and how much they value in education. You also see a lot of the times where you're applying the proverbial square peg into the round hole as far as what the structure of the APR is and being able to get points back. We had a student athlete that was offered a lucrative job due to a family connection that was not athletics related and made a economic decision that it was more in their economic interest to take this job instead of continuing with their college education, talking about a six-figure job. So a lot of people, that's an easy decision. In that situation, should we be punished because of that opportunity was provided for that kid? I think there's it's a great idea, and I think that there's a lot of merit behind the idea of the APR, but when you put the rubber to the road, a lot of the times you get the square peg with the round hole. So that's what I would do.
Hadn't heard that perspective on the APR.
Yeah, I hadn't either.
I understand the issues you're talking about, but part of me kind of likes the APR because obviously it's another way to get your coaches to make sure they're staying focused on the situation for their kids, and there's some rewards for that. Again, I made a comment earlier about that probably could come across as critical, and I don't mean it to be critical towards Dr. Emmer because I think a lot of what he's trying to put forward is very good, so I want to make sure that's included in the statement, especially if it's that's not .com. Again, what's concerning me, I think what Mike's talking about at a different level, I think that's a real possibility at some point. I'm 40 years old, so I could see that potentially in my lifetime as an AD, knock on wood, I can survive for a few years. And but I would I'd want to make sure when we're doing these things that we're getting good input from the people at the ground level who are involved in these things on a daily basis. I think that's important for us. And you know who the last president of the NCAA was that came from the athletic director's role? Ted Dempsey. He was AD at Arizona. He was 2 ADs before me. And then Jim Livengood was there for 16 years. And so before that it was Dick Schultz. He was an AD. Before that it was Walter Byers? Yeah, it was Walter Byers who was the first president of the NCAA.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah. And so I think what you saw for a while was the model they were using was to have it come from the AD position. I'm not saying that's what you have to do necessarily, but I think it's important that you are surrounded by some people on that staff that have a real good grasp of what's taking place on the institutional level when making those type of decisions because of the impact that it has on us. And just like if you would have said to me at the beginning, multi-year scholarship like I talked about, I would have thought, boy, that's a good idea. And until I talked to our SAT group on our campus and I heard their concerns, then I thought, you know what, maybe there's a perspective we're missing on this one. And again, that's just one institution, so I think it's important that you don't lose sight of having some institutional involvement.
Can I say something? I do appreciate your comments, and in fact, and some of this is beyond you all as far as a sports law perspective, but what Mike and Greg had mentioned, we've heard that, and at our level, we've definitely heard that through the cabinets, through the committees, The good news is I think we've seen it through the overrides, but we've got one, barely successful, one not successful, and that was his big baby, if you will, initially. All of this coming out of the presidential retreat that he held that Mike mentioned in 2011, August. A lot of this we thought was going to start literally getting pushed through this April, starting in Monday. We were just notified that some of the working groups have started to pull back a bit, including the enforcement working group, which is the new structure of the penalties and the procedures in that way. And I think we've all internally finally kind of said, been able to take a moment, take a breath, and say thank God, because we are at that level. We hear it. I'm out there talking to Division I football coaches, basketball coaches, and we're hearing this. What is happening? Do you realize that I don't agree with this? I think the majority of my folks in my league or my conference, whatever. So we do appreciate those comments, and I think keep them coming loud and clear. That's the only way it's going to continue to rise up to say this all doesn't need to be done in April. In fact, some of it is starting to be pushed back till August and hopefully further, so that we're doing the right thing.
And his credit, he's meeting with some ADs here soon.
Yeah,
and which is good. The last thing I do is on enforcement, and I know enough to be dangerous. Renee's certainly much more of an expert than I am when it comes to that, but they have some different, they have flexibility. Roger Goodell does in how he handles penalties in their model compared to our model right now. But it's been interesting watching that, and obviously one here locally that's had a big impact. Hey, I always tell our coaches, if the speed limit's 70, we better be going 70, okay? If you go 75, you better report it, better be an accident. And if you keep going 75, there's going to be some issues. And if you're going 90, you're in deep kimchi. And so what I want is how do we, and some of the steps from the governance standpoint I think is really good that we're trying to take to simplify and make sure the axe murders are being focused on instead of, if you send a text message or, they're the jaywalkers instead. And so I think that's really important to stay focused on it, and when there's an opportunity to send messages, and I think that's how you get it. I heard Urban Meyer, I was on USC had a 7-on-7 football deal a couple weeks ago at USC, and I spoke with the ADs in the Pac-12, and Urban Meyer was part of the group too, and he was on Skype, we Skyped him in, I guess, and he just talked about in the 1980s, steroids were such a major issue, and there were significant penalties that came along with that. And now, not to say that they don't exist, but you certainly don't hear. Our student athletes get tested for them regularly. You don't hear about it happening in positive tests for that. So that I think we've gotten our arms around that in a much better way than where we were 20 to 25 years ago with that.
Last but not least, this is all recommendations if I was the NCAA czar, so it's like 10 pages, so I'll be brief. As someone who has and currently does represent both axe murderers and jaywalkers in the NCAA process, I would like to see what at least in my mind, and I think some people in enforcement would agree with me, more common sense. And what I hear from enforcement when I deal with enforcement people, whether it be SAR or AMA, is, well, you got to take that to membership. We have no flexibility on this rule here. So, for example, my buddy Ennis Cantor, we tried hard to get that kid to play for Coach Cal, who I think people would think is an axe murderer. I think is.
You said that.
That's not on the record. I like Cal. We get along great. But I think there's the perception sometimes of axe murderers. And then the jaywalkers who happen to be associated with them, let's say student athletes, then get a target put on them. I don't know if what happened with Ennis would have happened if he would have ended up going to Washington versus going to Kentucky. And I think part of my experience, at least in enforcement, is from having student athletes I represent at Duke or Notre Dame, versus having a student athlete I represent who might be at UNLV or Kentucky or that school in Tempe. I think there are, for good reasons on the NCAA's part, certain people have certain credibility when you come up. But I just wish there was more compassion and common sense for individual athletes. the fact that I could not use the standard that was set up in the Cam Newton case for Ennis Cantor just seemed ridiculous to me. But as conversations I've had with numerous people at the NCAA, they're two different buckets because you're talking about an international student versus a transfer student. And to me, it seemed terrible that there was an innocent kid who's a great kid who really wanted to get an education. His dad is a dean of a university in Turkey. There was an offer, whatever reasonable and necessary expenses were over, we would have paid the overage, and there was inflexibility. And I understand that that's because of the framework of the rules that enforcement has to operate in. But there just needs to be more common sense. And maybe that's just saying you guys need to have the ability to be able to use more common sense and not be so tied to the rules that are set up by membership. So that's my one of 1,000.
Okay, so we have any questions and open it up? The first one I saw.
There has been some talk, obviously, about forming another level. I'm wondering if, at some point in the future, what you all thought the possibility might be if we ever got to a second division type thing of those institutions, whether it's creating their own basketball league or creating their own enforcement mechanism, enforcement framework, almost creating their own NCAA. Because I know there's been some talk about eventually that.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Tim, do you have this one?
There is certainly, especially when you come to major infractions cases and enforcement issues, that is the frustration. And when I talk to coaches, the response is, we don't need to put up with this bullshit. We can start our own thing and we'll make more money and we'll do our own thing. And you hear that, I hear that from high school associations too. So I deal with the high school issues, and I might represent private high schools that are powerhouse and regularly win state in football and basketball, and they get a multiplier thrown up against them by the high school association, and they don't want any part of it. And they say, we're going to start our own league, and we're going to bring in AAU, and we're going to have team sponsorships, and we're going to do whatever we want. And I think that's the response you get in any league. You get that from the owner of the Dallas Cowboys, you get that from the New York Yankees. If you're on top and you feel like you're being targeted, you think you have the ability to separate yourself from everyone else. And at that point, you can make your own rules, and those rules that you would set up would be favorable to you, and you would do better. I think that was the idea behind the BCS. You can do it better than the NCAA, so let's just do it. So,
I would think that just a little bit more on what Tim was saying, just a little. And that is, I think that anything is possible, I think, when you take a look at like institutions and taking a look at the commonalities that are there with them and the brand value that those common folks bring to the table. There's a certain brand value that Ohio State and Louisville and Kentucky and KU bring to the table. You can throw 4 other teams in there that perhaps are different than those 4. And so throw the 4, Cinderellas, I don't know, that won whatever games maybe that we won this particular year. And you have a completely different brand value for CBS. And they're going to be going, holy cow, we didn't pay for this. Okay? So that's reality. That's just reality. And while there are people that don't want to recognize that, people that want to be able to ignore that, that is absolute reality. That's the reason why, like Tim was saying, the BCS was set up. There is a value that's associated with that, and there was an opportunity there to create that value and to be able to regulate that value in a consistent way. So if you got to that point, I think anything would. But at the same time, you want to be sensitive. You want to have confidence. You want to be sensitive. You want to be understanding. You want to be beneficial to the entire industry. But at the same time, I think anything could be possible.
I'd imagine you'd come across a legal hornet's nest with outside agreements. I was actually talking to Stu Brown over here the other day, and we were talking about the realignment issue and some of the contractual obligations that schools have entered into under the assumption that they would remain in their conference. That would probably be impacted tenfold if you start talking about leaving the NCAA and going to other conferences and finding competitors. I would think would be the other thing. The NCAA would probably respond by creating some legislation that would forbid its member institutions from playing
Antitrust.
the other guys. So you're talking about competition opportunities that are off the board for us, but that might mean less guarantee games, which is a large part of what supplements our budget. Thanks to guys like Missouri. So.
I don't know if it'll happen or not as far as another level. It could, but I also think, going back to a little bit from the messaging of what we're doing, I tell our donors all the time this, and I feel this very sincerely, 98% of what takes place in college athletics is really good. We've had multiple donors at Arizona that I know that part of why they give is because they believe in the opportunities that are created through college sports for young people. Okay? And all you got to do is you go watch our tennis team play, either our tennis teams play, go watch our swimmers, go watch our gymnasts, go watch our basketball student athletes and get to know them, our football student athletes and get to know them, and you realize there's some great stories in there. And obviously, controversy sells, and so a lot of times, whatever the controversial subject is that's going on in our industry is going to be the focal point. And naturally, people kind of assume, we deal in a world of assumptions, okay? People assume that it's just the way it is across the board. I think the great majority of coaches, I think the great majority of athletic administrators and universities are trying to do things the right way, that really genuinely care whether their kids graduate or not. I really do believe it. I know we do at Arizona, okay? And I know they do at Mizzou, and I'm sure you all too. So, but I think part of it is whether we go to another level or not is getting an opportunity to send that message. And I think right now that some of the messaging the NCAA does from, we all turn professional in something, but most of it's not sports. I think that's a great message. I think it needs to almost be another party delivering that message as well. That's some really genuine tales from our student athletes themselves, messaging that out to the public and what takes place, because it's awesome. I mean, it's absolutely awesome some of the kids you get to deal with, the great majority of the kids you get to deal with, and the stories they tell and the impact that intercollegiate athletics has had on them and what it means to them.
This question I think pertains to everybody, just about social media. I guess one from the NCAA standpoint, how does the language expand to new social media outlets like Twitter and Pinterest? And then from the school standpoint, how do you, what exactly do you deal with when you tell players what kind of content they can put in tweets? For instance, I read in ESPN's Dumbest Tweets, an Auburn football player asking who was good at writing poli-sci essays. And then, so do you deal with, obviously, stuff like that? Do you deal with just personal beliefs and views? Do you deal with, what Mendenhall said that got him kicked out of his sponsorship contracts? Or?
Well, it's different with the sponsorship contracts because you have morality clauses that are within sponsorship contracts, and it'll say anything from, you can't, if you're convicted of a crime, then that's out there, but then you have people like Tiger Woods and Michael Vick who ruined it for everybody else. So now it says anything that will be seen as bringing bad imaging to the brand. You're out to protect the brand. Rashard Mendenhall got dropped from his Hanes contract, something like that?
He was
Champion, because he made a comment that we shouldn't be celebrating Osama bin Laden being killed. Well, maybe that would be okay if he was playing on the 49ers, but it's not okay if you're playing in Pittsburgh. So it's also your audience. You got to know who your brand is. And I think that would apply to schools as well. Something that's going to fly for Florida State's not going to fly for BYU or Notre Dame.
And that kind of gets to the issue again of what the NCAA legislation, we are not trying to sit here and say we do not want your student athletes tweeting, or we only want your student athletes tweeting this. We're just going to say you put certain policies and procedures in place, be comfortable. Miami is going to have a situation that's completely different than Miami of Ohio, in the middle of Ohio, and we have to be cognizant of that, and that's where we cannot fit, the square peg into the round hole. From our legislation's perspective, as far as social media, right now the only thing we do legislate is that coaches can't use it as a recruiting tool within the same parameters, time frames, like you're not allowed to email prospects until July 1st after their sophomore year, what have you. So they can't use social media as a way to get around phone calls or other permissible recruiting tools. And we don't want student athletes or representatives of the institution's athletics interests, otherwise known as boosters, recruiting for the schools through, at all, but we specifically said not even through social media. But beyond that, we don't get into the, nitty gritty, and we can't for that exact reason.
We got time for probably one more, and then we got a reception afterwards, so hopefully you can try to grab one and ask a question. I think I saw you first.
What do you see as the role of the NCAA in going to high schools and educating student athletes and preparing them to get, into Division I college athletics, which is very different than dealing, high schools in the inner city? What do you see as, if you go to anyone?
We are starting to do a better job of that. I mean, we have a Department of Educational Services, and that does a lot of our life skills programs, and we've tried to do that. I think maybe 10 years ago, we would try to just focus on perhaps inner city or at-risk prospects and that kind of thing, but we've obviously realized, we need to do more in that area. One thing our department is doing, and we have a separate sport-specific focus in men's basketball. Women's basketball has been added recently, and football now. The football has been in place for about a year and a half. Men's basketball has been in place, I guess, about 4 or 5 years now. And as part, enforcement is completely different, and generally we can clear a room like that. We're not coming in to educate folks, but we've added that piece to it. I mean, I've seen Andy at all-star events for, big-time football, whether it's in South Florida or whether we're in Texas, whether we're in California, and we're starting to add that piece to it. If Under Armour is holding the All-American event in Orlando, we can be there not only to get to know folks that are around that event, but get to sit down with the prospects. If we can get the top 90 football prospects in the country in the same room, for 30 minutes, talk to them about social media, talk to them about recruiting, and better educate them on, it's not just about going to Florida State and being successful on the field. What is your major? What are you going to do? So we're starting to be a lot more cognizant of that and try to add that. I think personally, this is not your typical enforcement view. I think we are responsible for that, and I think we have to start adding that piece in before kids 4 years from now are sitting in front of the committee or their coaches. Where were you 4 years ago to help us? At least then I can say, I told you, if you go do something, we use the word knucklehead, you want to do that 2 years from now, that's on you, and now you're an adult and you have to be accountable. But I do think that, we're understanding a little bit more about that shared responsibility, and we can't just point it all at the institutions.
And there are third parties in that space now, like the National Collegiate Scouting Association. So those are paid for services by the student athletes. So there are certain entities that are in that space that are helping out. I mean, certainly it's in their interest to help out if you're getting paid to do it, but when you have the amount of athletes that companies like that have, they can spread the messaging too. And I know that they're on good paper with you guys as their lawyer. I think they're on good paper with you. So.
I think it's something that I can tell you, coming from Mississippi State, there were high schools in our state that didn't offer the core courses and to the level that you needed them to. And so, as much as you can spend time educating the schools on what you're asking them, because they all want to have student athletes come to the different institutions and have those opportunities. So, spending time educating both from the NCAA level and from the institutional level, the ability to say, this is what we have to get focused on, and they have to start that as freshmen. And hopefully before that, even in middle schools and elementary schools, that they're getting the education to prepare them to be able to have the courses done that are required. So admission and eligibility is something that can not be as big an issue as what it sometimes is.
I believe there's an untapped legal market to the extent that it could be tapped for providing seminars and educational seminars for high school prospects, and maybe even direct consultation services for some of your big-time prospects. With the change in the academic rules model for core classes, for instance, now with the NCAA rule changes, the high school athletes are going to be required to spread their core courses that they earn throughout their high school year, to prevent situations where a senior in high school goes to correspondence, non-traditional courses, or whatever else, and gets 10 of their 16 core courses their senior year. This type of information is stuff that you want to know, and stuff that parents will be willing to pay for to know and to be consulted and to attend some of these seminars. And I imagine that you'll probably see growth in that area too.
Okay, great. Well, thank you once again to all the panelists.